Leah, please. Nobody cares about soil acidity and terroir anymore. It's old-fashioned. My brother Nathan's voice cut through the low buzz of the Portland Grand Wine Auction. My face burned. The small circle of vintners and critics I'd been speaking with suddenly found the ceiling fascinating. He flashed his perfectly white marketing smile, the one that always worked on our parents. That was my role in the family. I was the quiet, knowledgeable rootstock. He was the flashy new label they put on the bottle. My name is Leah, and I'm 31. For most of my life, I've been the roots of my family's vineyard, hidden under the soil, doing the essential work nobody sees. My brother Nathan has always been the brightly colored fruit, the thing they proudly display to the world. Our vineyard sits in the heart of Oregon's Willamette Valley. It's not the biggest, but it has a history, a legacy. My grandfather, a man who understood the language of the soil better than he understood people, spent his life cultivating a unique grape variety here. It wasn't a Pinot Noir or a Chardonnay. It was his. The Eleanor, he called it after my grandmother. It was resilient, complex, and yielded a wine with notes of wild blackberry and damp earth that critics had once called unforgettable. After he passed my parents, Susan and Michael took over. They were more interested in the aesthetics of owning a vineyard than the agriculture of it. They loved hosting wine-tasting events and having their picture in local magazines. The actual winemaking, the dirt under the fingernails work, that fell to me. I didn't mind. I loved it. I loved the rhythm of the seasons, the smell of the fermenting grapes, the quiet satisfaction of seeing a vintage come to life. But for the past 2 seasons, something has been wrong. The leaves on the old Eleanor vines, the ones my grandfather planted himself, were yellowing at the edges. The fruit was smaller, the clusters sparse. At first I thought it was a nutrient deficiency, maybe an issue with the soil. I spent months testing, adjusting, trying to nurse them back to health. But it only got worse. Last month, I finally got the diagnosis from the university's agricultural lab, a fungal blight, a particularly aggressive strain that attacks the vascular system of older vines, slowly choking them from the inside out. The specialist said, we had maybe one more season before the original Eleanor vines were lost forever. But there was a treatment. A new intensive organic protocol that involved uprooting each vine, treating the root system directly, and replanting it in enriched soil. It was labor-intensive, it was expensive, and it was our only shot. I spent weeks putting together a proposal. I researched contractors, priced out materials, calculated labor costs. The final number was $90,000. A lot of money, but a fraction of what the vineyard was worth. More than that, it was the price to save my grandfather's entire legacy. I chose my moment carefully. A Tuesday evening family dinner. My son, 7-year-old Luke, was at a sleepover, so it was just the 4 of us. Me, my parents, and Nathan, who was visiting from Portland. I laid out the proposal on the dining table, the lab reports, the cost breakdown, the timeline. The blight is moving faster than I anticipated, I explained, my voice steady. If we don't act before the spring planting season, we'll lose the heritage block. All of Grandpa's original vines will be gone. My father Michael picked up the quote from the contractor, his brow furrowed. $90,000, Leah, that's a huge risk. The bigger risk is doing nothing, I countered. Those vines are irreplaceable. They're the soul of our brand. The soul of the brand isn't paying the bills, my mother Susan chimed in. She was looking at a picture of Nathan's latest marketing campaign on her phone. Our Pinot Gris is what sells. People want what's popular, what's easy to drink. The Eleanor wine is what makes us unique, I insisted. It's what sets us apart from every other vineyard in the valley. It's our story. It's an old story, Nathan said, not even looking up from his laptop. He was probably designing another sleek ad for something. The market has changed, Leah. People want new, exciting things. They want convenience. They want a brand, not a history lesson. I looked from my father's skeptical face to my mother's distracted expression, to my brother's casual dismissal. It was a familiar feeling, the feeling of being the only one in the room who cared about the substance, not the surface. "This isn't just about business," I said quietly. "This is about Grandpa. This is his life's work." My father sighed, setting the proposal down. "Leah, you're being sentimental. We have to be realistic. Dropping $90,000 on a block of old vines that might not even survive the treatment, it's not a sound investment right now. I've talked to the specialists I pushed. They're confident the protocol has a 95% success rate. This isn't a gamble. It's a rescue mission." "We'll think about it," my mother said, a phrase that in my family meant, "The conversation is over and the answer is no. We have to be sensible. We have other financial priorities to consider." I looked at their faces at the comfortable disinterest and felt a cold knot form in my stomach. They weren't just questioning the cost. They were questioning the value of the one thing I held sacred. They were questioning the very roots of our family, and they didn't even seem to realize it. My father cleared his throat, a sound that always meant a verdict was coming. "Leah," he said, his voice laced with manufactured gravity, "after careful consideration, your mother and I have decided we can't approve the expenditure." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. "It's just too much of a risk," he continued, throwing that kind of money at old vines. "We have to think about the business as a whole." I didn't say anything. I just nodded a slow, tired movement of my head. The fight had already gone out of me. That's when Nathan leaned forward, a predator, sensing a vacuum. "Well, since we're talking about sound investments and the future of the business," he slid his laptop across the table, turning it to face my parents. On the screen was a sleek presentation full of colorful graphics and bold fonts. "I've been working on a new concept," he said, his voice electric with the kind of passion my parents reserved for him. "It's about disrupting the market, targeting a whole new demographic." He clicked through slides showing attractive young people laughing on rooftops, holding brightly colored cans. "Canned wine," he announced, as if he'd just invented electricity. "Single-serving, Instagrammable cans of premium Rosé. We target millennials at festivals, picnics, rooftop bars. It's not about terroir or history. It's about lifestyle. It's about convenience." My mother leaned in, her eyes wide with fascination. "Oh, Nathan, that's brilliant. So modern." "The margins are incredible," he went on. "And the branding potential is through the roof. I've already designed the cans. Look at this." He showed them a mock-up of a slim can with a minimalist logo. My stomach turned. He wanted to put our family's name on a product that was the complete antithesis of everything my grandfather stood for. "This is the future," Mom Nathan said. "We can be the first vineyard in the valley to really capture this market." My father, who just moments before had been a stone-faced bastion of fiscal responsibility, was now beaming. "That's my boy, always thinking ahead." He looked at Nathan with a pride that was a physical blow to me. "How much do you need to get the first run started?" $120,000 for the initial canning line and marketing push," Nathan said, the number rolling off his tongue with casual confidence. "Done," my father said without a moment's hesitation. "We'll transfer the funds next week." $120,000. $30,000 more than what I had begged for to save the very soul of our vineyard. The room went quiet, but only for me. For them, a celebration was just beginning. They were already talking about launch parties, about media kits, about the color of the cans. I just sat there, my fork heavy in my hand, pushing a piece of chicken around my plate. It's a phenomenon sociologists talk about, though I didn't have a name for it then. The normalization of cruelty. In some families, a system of value is established so early and so completely that it ceases to feel like a choice. It just is. Nathan was the golden child, the one whose ventures were always investments, whose ideas were always brilliant. I was the scapegoat, the one whose passions were sentimental, whose requests were risks. Their refusal to help me wasn't an act of malice in their minds. It was simply the natural order of things, as logical as the sun rising in the east. They weren't being monsters. They were just maintaining a system where only one child's success was ever truly part of the budget. And in that moment I understood why I didn't scream, why I didn't flip the table, why I just sat there in silence. People watching from the outside always ask that. Why did you stay? Why didn't you fight back? They don't understand the invisible chains. They call it learned helplessness, a psychological state where you've been conditioned for so long to believe your actions don't matter that you simply stop acting. It's a prison without iron bars, built from years of knowing that your voice won't be heard, that your needs will be dismissed. Fighting back didn't just seem pointless. It felt dangerous. It would only lead to more lectures about being dramatic, more accusations of being ungrateful. My silence wasn't weakness. It was a survival mechanism honed over a lifetime of being the overlooked daughter. It was the only armor I had left. I stood up from the table. I should get going, I said quietly. My mother looked up momentarily, pulled from her excitement. Oh, already. But we haven't even discussed dessert. I'm tired, I said. It's been a long day. Of course, dear, she replied, her attention already drifting back to Nathan's laptop. Drive safe. No one else said goodbye. I walked out of the house I grew up in, leaving them to toast to a future I was no longer a part of. The cold night air felt sharp against my face, and for the first time it felt like a relief. It felt like breathing. The 20-minute drive back to my apartment was a blur. I kept the windows down, letting the cold Oregon air whip through the car, trying to blow away the suffocating feeling from that dining room. I replayed the conversation in my head, the casual dismissal, the effortless way they pledged a fortune to Nathan's vapid project after denying me a fraction of that to save our history. I was pulling into my parking spot when my phone rang. I almost ignored it, assuming it was my mother calling to add some final passive-aggressive jab. But the name on the screen was Aunt Maria, my mother's older sister. She was the executor of my grandfather's estate and a force of nature, sharp pragmatic, and the only person in the family my father was genuinely afraid of. She lived in a small cottage on the far side of the vineyard property, acting as its quiet, watchful guardian. I hadn't seen her at dinner, which wasn't unusual. She often avoided my mother's performative family meals. I answered, my voice still shaky. Hi, Aunt Maria. Leah, I saw you leave. Are you all right? Her voice was clipped, no nonsense. I'm fine, I lied. Don't lie to me, she snapped. I was on the porch. I heard the whole damn thing through the open window. The blight, the 90,000, the canned wine, nonsense. Every word. Tears pricked my eyes. Someone else had heard. I wasn't crazy. I'm so angry I could spit, she continued, her voice like gravel. Your grandfather poured his soul into those vines, and they're going to let it all die so Nathan can sell alcoholic fruit juice to children over my dead body. There's nothing I can do, I whispered. They said no. Of course they said no. To you, she said, and the way she said it made me feel seen for the first time all night. You're the responsible one, so you don't need help. Nathan's a liability, so he gets a blank check. It's the family way. It was their way with your mother, and me too. It's a sickness. She took a breath. I'm heading over there right now. What Aunt Maria don't. It's not worth it. It'll just be a huge fight. Good, she said. It's about time someone in this family had a real fight instead of all this polite, soul-crushing nonsense. Don't you worry, Leah. You just stay put. I'll call you back. She hung up before I could protest. I stood in my silent apartment phone in my hand, imagining the storm that was about to break over my parents' house. Part of me was terrified. The other part felt a tiny, unfamiliar flicker of hope. 45 minutes later, my phone rang again. It was Maria. It's done, she said, her voice calm but firm. What's done? What happened? I walked in while they were still celebrating Nathan's brilliant canned wine idea. I let them finish their little toast. Then I informed your parents that, as the trustee of your grandfather's agricultural fund, I have a fiduciary duty to protect the estate's primary assets. And the primary, most valuable asset of that vineyard is not the Pinot Gris. It's the Eleanor Heritage Block. I sank onto my couch, barely breathing. I told them their decision was not just sentimental foolishness, it was gross negligence, and that I would not stand by and watch them squander my father's legacy. What did they say? I asked. Oh, your mother tried to cry. Your father tried to bluster about it being his business. Nathan told me I didn't understand modern marketing. She let out a short, harsh laugh. I reminded them that the trust owns 40% of the land, and that the terms of the trust give me oversight on any capital expenditure or lack thereof that endangers the long-term viability of the estate. The line went quiet for a moment. So, I'm funding it, Leah. The $90,000. It's coming from the trust. I've already emailed the lawyer. The contractor will have a check by the end of the week. You are going to save those vines. I couldn't speak. The relief was so sudden, so overwhelming, it felt like a physical weight being lifted off my chest. Aunt Maria, thank you. Don't thank me, she said. This isn't a gift. This is a correction. This is me doing what my father would have wanted, what he should have put in writing. Her voice softened slightly. He always said you had his hands, you know. The hands of a grower? I was openly crying now, silent tears streaming down my face. Now listen to me, she said, her voice turning serious again. This is just the beginning. They are going to be furious. They will see this as a betrayal. This is a declaration of war, Leah. You understand that, don't you? I think so, I whispered. Good. Get some rest. You have a vineyard to save. I hung up the phone and looked around my small, quiet apartment. It suddenly felt different. It no longer felt like a refuge from my family. It felt like a command center. A war had just been declared on my behalf. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I might actually have a chance to win. I didn't have to wait long for the fallout. The first text arrived less than 5 minutes after I hung up with Maria. It was from Nathan. You actually went crying to Aunt Maria. That's a new level of pathetic, even for you. You can't win on your own merits, so you get the old guard to fight your battles. Sad. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. 100 angry responses flying through my mind. I typed nothing. Before I could even set the phone down, another message came through. My mother. Leah, your father and I are deeply disappointed. To go behind our backs and manipulate your aunt like this is a betrayal of this family. You have created a terrible division. A division, as if a chasm hadn't been there all along, carved out by decades of their casual neglect. The final text was from my father. It was short and chilling. This is not over. You do not get to dictate the financial future of this vineyard. We will handle this. Handle this. The words felt less like a promise and more like a threat. I felt a tremor of the old fear, the conditioned instinct to apologize, to retreat, to make myself small again so the conflict would go away. But then I thought of my grandfather's vines choking silently in the dark. I thought of Aunt Maria's voice, sharp and clear, as she declared war on my behalf. My phone rang again. Maria. "They've started," was all I said. "Let me guess," she replied, her voice dry as old kindling. "Nathan called you pathetic. Your mother is disappointed, and your father is making vague, ominous threats." Word for word. "How did you know?" "Because they are painfully predictable, Leah. They've been running the same tired plays for 30 years. She paused, and I could hear the sound of her pouring a drink in the background. "I'm calling because I just left their house. For the second time tonight." "You went back?" "I did. After they finished their little text message tantrum, I decided we needed to clarify the terms of our new arrangement. I wanted to look them in the eye while I laid down the law. I could picture it perfectly. My aunt, barely 5'3", but with a spine forged from Willamette Valley bedrock, standing in my parents' perfectly decorated living room while they sputtered with impotent rage. I informed them, Maria said, her voice dropping, becoming colder and more serious, that this is no longer a simple family disagreement. I told them that I have instructed my lawyer to begin a full review of their stewardship of the vineyard since my father's passing. I reminded them that their inheritance was conditional on their being faithful guardians of his legacy. "What does that actually mean?" I asked, my heart starting to pound. "It means," she said slowly, letting the weight of each word land, "that if they make one move to obstruct your work on the heritage block, if they transfer one more dollar to Nathan's ridiculous canned wine fantasy before that vineyard is safe, I will formally challenge their right to inherit their portion of the estate." The line went silent. The gravity of her words settled over me. This wasn't about saving the vines anymore. This was about everything. The house, the land, the entire future of our family was now on the table. "They think this is about you being sentimental," Maria continued. "They think it's about you being jealous. They need to understand that this is about the sanctity of a promise I made to my father on his deathbed. I promised him I would protect what he built, and I will, even if it means protecting it from his own children." "They're going to hate me," I whispered, the words tasting like ash. "They're going to fear you," she corrected. "There's a difference. For the first time in your life, Leah, you are not the one in the weaker position. You have the legacy, the law, and the truth on your side. Let them hate that. Let them choke on it." She was right. I wasn't the supplicant anymore. This wasn't a family squabble that could be smoothed over with a forced apology at Christmas dinner. The battle lines had been drawn not in the dirt of the vineyard rows, but on legal paper. It was my parents and Nathan on one side, and on the other it was me, Aunt Maria, and the ghost of my grandfather standing guard over what was real. The week that followed was a cold war fought over text messages and stony silences. My parents cut off all direct communication, but the chill was palpable. Nathan sent a few more sneering messages, which I ignored. I threw myself into the logistics of the rescue operation, coordinating with the contractor and the university specialists. I was so focused on the work that I almost managed to forget the family storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Then, on a gray Saturday morning, Maria called. "Can you come over to the cottage, Leah? There are some things we need to discuss in person, some things you deserve to know." Her tone was heavy. It wasn't a request for a social call. I drove over my stomach, twisting with a familiar anxiety. Her cottage was small and smelled of old books and dried lavender. She had a fire crackling in the hearth, and she poured me a cup of strong black tea without asking if I wanted any. She sat across from me in her worn armchair, her face etched with a seriousness that scared me. First things first, she began, her gaze unwavering. You need to understand why I'm doing this now, why I didn't step in years ago. I waited, my hands wrapped around the warm mug. I'm sick, Leah. She said it flatly, no room for pity. The doctors gave me a year, maybe less. I found out 6 months ago. The teacup rattled in my hands. The one person who had ever truly stood up for me was leaving. Don't look at me like that, she said, her voice sharp but not unkind. I've had a good life. But a diagnosis like this, it clarifies things. It burns away the unimportant nonsense. And for the past 6 months, I've been watching your parents, waiting, hoping they'd finally see you, finally value what you bring to that vineyard. But they didn't. Last week at that dinner, I realized I was out of time. I can't leave this world knowing I left you in their hands without a shield. Tears blurred my vision. Aunt Maria, Let me finish, she interrupted. That's the why. Now for the what, the real reason I'm having my lawyer tear through their finances. She leaned forward, her eyes hard. This blight isn't an act of God, Leah. It's the end result of a decision they made years ago. A crime. A crime! What are you talking about? Do you remember the barn fire about 10 years ago? You were in college. It wasn't a big deal. Mostly old equipment destroyed. No one was hurt. I vaguely remembered. A call from my dad saying, everything was fine, just a bit of a mess. Well, the insurance payout for that fire wasn't small, Maria continued. It was $150,000, and it was specifically earmarked for infrastructure upgrades. Your grandfather had a plan to replace the entire irrigation system for the heritage block. The old pipes were failing, and he knew those vines were the most vulnerable. She took a sip of her tea, her knuckles white. But the irrigation system was never upgraded. The money just vanished. Your father claimed the insurance company had undervalued the damages, that the payout just covered the cleanup. I was suspicious, but I had no proof. He was my brother-in-law, and I tried to believe him. She set her cup down with a clatter. My lawyer found the bank records yesterday. They never paid for a new irrigation system. They transferred the entire $150,000 into your father's personal account. And from there, he paid off a series of bad business debts he'd racked up. What was left, about $30,000, he gave to Nathan to buy that ridiculous sports car he drove all through college. The room was spinning. They stole from the vineyard, I whispered. They stole from Grandpa's legacy. They stole from you, Maria corrected, her voice fierce. A proper irrigation system would have made those vines stronger, more resilient. It might have prevented this blight entirely, or at least given us a better chance to fight it. They took money meant to protect your grandfather's work and used it to clean up their own messes and spoil their favorite son. It wasn't just neglect, Leah. It was theft. And this, she gestured vaguely in the direction of the dying vines. This is the consequence. I stared into the fire, the flames blurring through my tears. The betrayal was so much deeper than I had ever imagined. It wasn't just that they didn't see my worth. It was that they had actively, secretly sabotaged the very thing I loved most, all for money. And they had let me believe for years that I was the one who was just being sentimental about a few old vines. I sat there for a long time, the crackle of the fire filling the silence. 10 years. For 10 years they had let me work that land, let me pour my sweat and my hope into those vines, all while knowing they had starved them of the very thing they needed to survive. They let me believe the problem was me, my methods, my lack of skill. What's left to say? I finally managed, my voice hollow. They're thieves. They chose money over their own father's legacy. Maria looked at me, her expression hardening. No, Leah, you still don't get it. It's worse than that. I looked up confused. Worse than stealing $150,000? Yes, she said, leaning forward again, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Because it wasn't just about the money, it was about erasure. Don't you understand what those vines are? They're Grandpa's original plantings, I said, the first Eleanor grapes. They're not just the first, Leah. They're the only. I stared at her, not comprehending. Your grandfather didn't just find that grape. She said her words slow and deliberate. He made it. He spent 2 decades cross-pollinating, grafting, experimenting. It was his masterpiece, a varietal that exists nowhere else on this planet. He coaxed it from the earth, and he gave it my mother's name. It wasn't just a product, Leah. It was his heart. His name is on the patent. It is quite literally his creation. The air left my lungs. All those years I had thought I was just a winemaker, a caretaker. I never knew. He never told me. He was so proud of it, Maria continued, a rare softness in her voice. But he was a quiet man. He wasn't a marketer like Nathan. He believed the work should speak for itself. He thought your parents, his own children, understood its value. The pieces clicked into place, forming a picture so ugly I could barely look at it. My work in that vineyard, it wasn't just a job. It was a conversation with him, a continuation of his life's work that I never even knew I was having. And my parents, they weren't just letting vines die. They were letting a man's life's work turn to dust. They wanted it gone, I whispered, the realization dawning on me like a black Sunday. Of course they did, Maria affirmed. The Eleanor was difficult. It was history. It was a constant reminder of a father they could never please, whose quiet integrity always made their loud ambition look cheap. They wanted something easy, something generic they could slap a new label on. They wanted Nathan's canned Rosé. They didn't want a legacy. They wanted a product. The betrayal was no longer just about money. It was a desecration. They had looked at my grandfather's soul hanging there on the vine and decided it was an inconvenience. And they had let me, the one person who would have guarded it with her life, work unknowingly toward its extinction. They had sentenced me to be the unwitting executioner of my own heritage. The grief I felt was sharp and suffocating, but underneath it, something else was taking root. A cold, hard anger that burned away the tears. This wasn't just a family dispute anymore. This wasn't about being the unloved daughter. This was about justice. I looked at Maria, and I knew she saw the change in my eyes. The hurt was still there, but it had crystallized into something else, purpose. They hadn't just stolen money. They were trying to erase a memory, and I was the only one left who could stop them. The invitation arrived via email 2 weeks later. It was sleek, animated, and obnoxious. A digital can of rosé fizzed open, revealing the details in a trendy sans serif font. Uncork the future. Be the first to experience Vivid, the new canned wine by Nathan Henderson. It was for a launch party at a rooftop gallery in Portland's Pearl District, an exclusive event for critics, influencers, and industry tastemakers. My mother forwarded it to me with a note. Nathan wanted to make sure you were included. I hope you'll come and support your brother. Support him. As if he were launching a life raft and not a marketing gimmick funded by Betrayal. I showed the invitation to Maria. She snorted, scrolling through the details on my phone. Look at this, she said, pointing to the list of sponsors. A vodka brand and a company that makes designer sunglasses. This isn't a wine launch. It's an accessories party." "I'm not going," I said. The thought of standing in a room full of people celebrating my brother's vapid creation while our grandfather's vines withered felt like a special kind of torture. "Oh, yes, you are," Maria said, her eyes glinting. "And I'm going with you. We're not going to celebrate. We're going to bear witness." And so on a crisp autumn evening, I found myself walking into the lion's den. The gallery was all white walls, polished concrete floors, and floor-to-ceiling windows with a glittering view of the city. A DJ played generic electronic music that throbbed in my chest. Waiters in black circulated with trays of Nathan's canned rosé and tiny, unidentifiable appetizers. The room was packed with people who all looked like they were performing for an invisible camera. They weren't tasting the wine. They were taking pictures of themselves holding the can. Nathan was in his element, holding court in the center of the room. He was wearing a ridiculously expensive-looking blazer and laughing too loudly at something a man with a perfectly sculpted beard had said. He hadn't seen us yet. My parents stood near the bar looking proud and proprietary. My mother was wearing a new dress, one I knew cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. She was talking to a woman who I recognized as a prominent local food blogger. They were all playing their parts in this expensive charade. The ice sculpture of the Vivid logo alone must have cost $10,000, Maria murmured in my ear, her voice dripping with contempt. That would have paid for the new rootstock treatment for an entire row of vines. Everywhere I looked, I saw the ghosts of what that money could have been. The custom cocktail napkins could have been fertilizer. The DJ's fee could have been a new irrigation pump. The entire party was a monument to their misplaced priorities, a glittering tombstone on my grandfather's legacy. We didn't try to blend in. We stood near the edge of the room, two somber figures in a sea of forced festivity. I felt a strange calm settle over me. I wasn't the scared, overlooked daughter anymore. I was an observer, a historian, documenting the final decadent days of a dying empire. Eventually my mother spotted us. Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she pasted it back on. She made her way through the crowd, my father trailing in her wake. "Leah Maria, you came," she said, her voice a little too bright. "We wouldn't miss it," Maria said dryly. "It's quite the event." "Isn't it wonderful?" my mother gushed. "Nathan has worked so hard on this. Everyone is just raving about the branding." My father looked at me, his expression unreadable. "Leah," he said, a note of warning in his voice, "I hope you're here to be supportive." "I'm here to observe," I said simply. Before he could respond, Nathan swaggered over a can of his wine in hand. "Well, well. Look who decided to show up. Come to see what a successful brand launch actually looks like." "Something like that," I replied, my voice even. He looked from me to Maria, his smirk faltering slightly at the sight of her stony expression. "Don't tell me you're still hung up on those old vines," he said with a dismissive laugh. "Leah, you've got to get with the times. This," he held up the can, "is what people want." I just looked at him, at the can, at the whole glittering, hollow spectacle. And for the first time, I didn't feel hurt. I felt pity. He really believed it. He thought this was success. He had no idea what he had thrown away. Nathan eventually took to a small makeshift stage at the front of the gallery, a microphone in hand. He gave a slick, 10-minute speech filled with buzzwords like disruption, brand activation, and democratizing the wine experience. It was a performance, and the crowd primed on free drinks and the promise of being part of something new ate it up. "And now," he said, flashing his perfect smile, "I'd love to answer any questions you might have about the future of wine." A young woman with bright pink hair, clearly an influencer, who had been invited for her follower count, raised her hand. "What was your biggest inspiration for creating Vivid Nathan launched into a rehearsed anecdote about seeing a gap in the market. It was all very polished. The next few questions were just as soft. A food blogger asked about potential food pairings. A marketing guy asked about their social media strategy. Nathan was confident, charming, and completely in control. He was selling a story, and he was good at it. I glanced over at Maria. She was standing perfectly still, her arms crossed, watching Nathan with an unreadable expression. Then I saw her gaze shift almost imperceptibly, catching the eye of an older man in the front row. He was impeccably dressed with a silver lapel pin, I recognized as the emblem of the International Wine Critics Guild. I knew who he was. Arthur Abernathy, a legend. His reviews could make or break a vineyard. What was he doing here? A moment later, Abernathy was handed the microphone. The energy in the room shifted. This wasn't a friendly influencer. This was a serious critic. Nathan, congratulations, Abernathy began, his voice smooth and authoritative. A very energetic launch. It's certainly a bold new direction for the Henderson name. Nathan preened, basking in the praise. Thank you, Arthur. We're very excited about it. I'm sure you are, Abernathy said. Then he paused, letting the silence hang in the air for just a second too long. But I have to admit, I'm a bit perplexed. I've followed your family's vineyard for decades. I was a great admirer of your grandfather's work, particularly his development of the Eleanor grape. It's a varietal of profound character and historical significance in this valley. I saw my father shift uncomfortably near the bar. There are some very concerning rumors circulating in the wine community. Abernathy continued, his tone still polite, but now with a sharp journalistic edge. Rumors that the original heritage block of those Eleanor vines is facing a terminal blight, possibly due to long-term neglect. So my question is this. How do you reconcile launching a modern mass-market brand with the simultaneous abandonment of the very legacy that gives your family name its prestige? The room went dead quiet. The DJ seemed to sense the mood, and the beat faded into a low thrum. Every eye in that gallery swung to my brother. I watched the practiced smile freeze on his face. I saw the flash of pure, unadulterated panic in his eyes. He looked to my father, who was staring at his shoes. He looked to my mother, whose face was a mask of horror. There was no one to save him. Well, Nathan stammered, his confidence evaporating under the weight of Abernathy's simple, devastating question. That's a great question, Arthur. We believe in innovation, in moving forward. He was floundering, falling back on the same empty words from his speech, but they sounded hollow now. Abernathy wasn't letting him go. He leaned forward slightly, his expression one of genuine curiosity. I understand the importance of innovation, but is innovation, in your view, mutually exclusive with preservation? It seems to many of us that a family's legacy is its most valuable asset. Is the Henderson legacy something to be so easily discarded? Discarded. The word landed like a stone in the silent room. Nathan opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He was a marketer, a salesman. He knew how to sell a feeling, an image, a lifestyle in a can. But he didn't know how to answer a question about substance because he had never been required to have any. He was a beautiful hollow bottle, and Arthur Abernathy had just held him up to the light for everyone to see he was empty. I watched my brother on that stage, trapped in the spotlight he had so desperately craved. He looked like a cornered animal. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape route, a lifeline. He found none. My parents were frozen statues in a museum of their own making. This was a crisis of authenticity, and they had no currency here. Finally, Nathan drew himself up, a flicker of his old arrogance returning. He tried to laugh it off, but the sound was thin and brittle. "Discard it, Arthur. That's such a strong word," he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We're not discarding anything. We're evolving. Look, every successful brand has to know when to pivot. You can't stay stuck in the past. My grandfather was a brilliant man, a true pioneer, but he was of a different era. He was trying to frame it as a business decision, a tough but necessary choice for the modern age. But his words were clumsy slick, with the sweat of panic. The wine industry isn't about dusty old bottles and sentimental stories anymore," he continued, his voice getting a little too loud, a little too fast. "It's about accessibility. It's about meeting the consumer where they are. And where they are," he gestured around the room at the influencers and their phones, "is online. They want a brand that speaks their language." Abernathy just listened, his expression neutral, giving Nathan all the rope he needed. "The truth is," Nathan said, leaning into the microphone, as if sharing a profound secret, "sometimes you have to clear out the old to make way for the new. That's how progress works. Those old vines, they've had their time. They're a beautiful piece of history, of course, but you can't build a future on a foundation that's crumbling." He took a breath, puffing out his chest, completely oblivious to the hole he had just dug for himself. "Those old, unproductive vines need to make room for the future." And vivid, he held up the can again, his voice ringing with a desperate finality. "Vivid is the future." Silence. It was absolute. The kind of silence that is so loud it hums in your ears. Not a single person clapped. No one murmured in agreement. I saw phone screens light up across the gallery as people, realizing they were witnessing a career suicide in real time, started recording. Arthur Abernathy didn't need to say another word. He simply gave a slow, deliberate nod, as if to say, "Thank you. You've answered my question perfectly." He handed the microphone back to a stunned event organizer and quietly returned to his seat. I looked at my brother. The confident marketer was gone. In his place was a scared, flushed young man who had just publicly confessed to the crime everyone had only been whispering about. He didn't care about his family's legacy. He saw it as a crumbling obstacle, not a sacred inheritance. The party died in that moment. The spell of branding and buzzwords was broken. The music, when it tried to start up again, sounded jarring and inappropriate. Small conversations began to sputter, but they were hushed, filled with the awkward energy of people witnessing a family's public implosion. Guests began to slip out, avoiding eye contact with my parents, who were now standing alone by the bar, looking shell-shocked. Maria caught my eye from across the room. She gave me a single, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a look of triumph. It was a look of grim confirmation. The truth was out. I didn't feel happy. I didn't feel vindicated. Watching my brother self-destruct on that stage, I just felt a profound and hollow sadness. He wasn't a villain. He was just the final logical product of my parents' value system, all surface, no roots. And when the first real storm came, he was washed away. Before we even left the gallery, my own phone buzzed. It was a link from a friend in the wine industry. The video was already online, titled "Henderson Heir Calls Grandfather's Legacy Old and Unproductive." The reckoning had begun. The drive home from Portland was the quietest I'd ever shared with Aunt Maria. The city lights receded behind us, and the darkness of the valley wrapped around the car. The thrum of the engine was the only sound for miles. "Well," she said, finally, as we turned onto the long gravel road leading to the vineyard, "that's that." There was no triumph in her voice, just the flat, weary finality of a battle won at a terrible cost. The next morning, the digital world was on fire. The video of Nathan's speech had been shared not just by party guests, but by every significant wine, blogger, and critic on the West Coast. The headlines were brutal. Henderson heirs ditch legacy for canned rosé. Another read, The Death of Terroir, How One Family Sold Its Soul in a Can. My brother, who had lived his life chasing attention, was finally getting it. My phone buzzed with an email from the contractor I had hired. Leah saw the news. Just want to confirm we are still a go on the Heritage Block restoration. Let me know. The vines can't wait. I wrote back immediately. Yes, we're still a go. Thank you. The consequences for Nathan's project were swift. The vodka brand that had sponsored the party released a statement distancing themselves from his disrespectful comments about agricultural heritage. The distributor who had signed on for the first run of Vivid pulled out, citing damage to the Henderson brand. By Tuesday, Nathan's future in a can was dead. He called me once, his voice a frantic, angry mess. Are you happy now? You and Maria, you ruined me. I didn't say anything. It was a good idea, he yelled, his voice cracking. It would have worked. I hung up the phone. The real blow, however, landed on Thursday. Maria's lawyer sent a formal 6-page letter to my parents. She forwarded a copy to me. It was a masterpiece of legal devastation. It laid out in excruciating detail the evidence of the insurance fraud from 10 years prior. It included copies of the bank statements showing the transfer of funds, the payments to my father's creditors, and the check for Nathan's car. The letter ended with an ultimatum. They had 2 options. Option 1, they could face a public lawsuit for fraud and embezzlement, along with a formal complaint to the district attorney's office. The scandal would not only destroy what was left of their reputation, but could very well land my father in prison. Or, option 2, they could sign a legally binding agreement to transfer full operational control and ownership of the Henderson Valley Vineyard to me, effective immediately. They would retain the right to live in their house on the property, but they would have no say in the business ever again. They were given 48 hours to decide. I didn't hear from them. The silence was absolute. I spent those 2 days in the vineyard walking the rows of dying Eleanor vines, touching their brittle leaves. It felt like sitting by a bedside, waiting for a fever to break. On Saturday morning, Maria called. Her voice was quiet, devoid of emotion. They signed, she said. What? I'm at the lawyer's office now. Michael and Susan are here. They just signed the transfer documents. The vineyard is yours, Leah. Completely. I sank down onto the cool dirt between 2 rows of vines, the phone pressed to my ear. I could hear muffled sounds in the background of the call, the rustle of papers, a choked sob that sounded like my mother. They had no choice, Maria continued. It was either lose their reputation or lose their freedom. They chose their reputation, as they always do. She was quiet for a moment. They look broken, Leah. I've never seen your father look so small. It should have felt like a victory. I had won. The vineyard was safe. My grandfather's legacy was secure. But as I sat there on the soil he had loved, all I could feel was the profound, aching weight of it all. It was harvest season in the Willamette Valley, but the only thing I had reaped was the bitter fruit of my family's downfall. The vineyard was mine, but I had never felt more alone. The first morning I woke up as the owner of Henderson Valley Vineyard, I didn't feel victorious. I felt the crushing weight of 150 acres of responsibility. I walked out onto the porch of my small apartment, coffee in hand, and looked east toward the property. It was just a dark line of hills against the pale dawn sky, but it was all mine. The dying vines, the healthy ones, the crushing debt I would have to take on to run it, the tainted family name, all of it. I didn't go to their house, the house my grandfather built. the house where my parents were now living as tenants on land that belonged to me. I couldn't. Instead, I drove straight to the heritage block. The contractor and his team were already there, their trucks idling the men drinking coffee and waiting for instructions. They looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and respect. They had all heard the story by now, the valley whispered. I walked with the crew foreman, a man named Sal, with hands as gnarled as a grapevine through the rows. "It's bad, Leah," he said, his voice gentle, "but not hopeless. We can save most of them if we move fast." And we did. The work was brutal. Each vine had to be carefully excavated, its fragile root system exposed. The specialists from the university were there, overseeing the application of the organic fungicide, a meticulous process of cleaning and treating each root ball. Then the replanting into soil. We had spent days amending with compost and nutrients. I was there from sunrise to sunset. I wasn't just overseeing. I was working. My hands were raw. My back ached. My clothes were permanently stained with the rich, dark soil of the valley. But it felt right. It felt like penance not for my sins, but for my family's. With every vine we replanted, it felt like I was physically pushing back against years of their neglect. I was anchoring my grandfather's legacy back into the earth where it belonged. Some days I would see my father's truck drive past on the main road, slowing down as he passed the heritage block, but he never stopped. He never got out. I imagined him watching the flurry of activity, this $90,000 rescue mission he had called a risk, and I wondered what he felt. Anger, regret, or just the bitter emptiness of a man who had lost his kingdom. One afternoon, sitting on the tailgate of Sal's truck, sharing a thermos of coffee, I watched a group of young interns from the university carefully wrapping the treated roots of a vine. They were so focused, so passionate. They were asking questions, taking notes, absorbing every detail. They saw what I saw. Not just old plants, but living history. And that's when the idea came to me. It wasn't enough to just save these vines. That was correcting the past. I needed to invest in the future. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by soil testing reports and invoices, and started writing. It wasn't a business plan. It was a mission statement. I decided that once the vineyard was profitable again, a full 10% of the net profits from the Eleanor wine would go into a new fund. I called it the Heritage Scholarship. It would be a grant for young agronomists and viticulturists, specifically for those working on preserving and reviving heirloom and indigenous grape varietals. It would fund the kind of work my grandfather had done in obscurity, the slow, patient, vital work of protecting biodiversity. It would give young growers the resources to save other legacies, other Eleanor grapes, from being lost to the market's demand for what was easy and popular. My family had tried to turn my grandfather's legacy into a disposable product. I would turn it into a perpetual gift. It wouldn't just be about our vineyard, our story. It would be about ensuring that other stories buried in the soil of forgotten valleys would have a chance to be told. The revenge wasn't in their downfall. The revenge would be in the growth that came from their ashes. It would be in the harvests of 100 future vineyards they would never see all seeded from the one they tried to let die. A year passed. A year of sun and rain and the slow, quiet work of healing. The heritage block, which had been a graveyard of brittle stalks and yellowed leaves, was breathing again. New shoots tentative at first, then bold and green unfurled from the old wood. The vineyard was alive. I walked the rows one evening in late summer, the air thick with the sweet smell of ripening grapes. My son Luke, now 8, ran ahead of me, his small hands gently touching the leaves. "They're not sick anymore, Mom," he said, his voice filled with a child's simple wonder. "No, buddy, they're not sick anymore," I said, kneeling down beside him. "We gave them the right medicine. I pointed to the gnarled base of a vine where the old trunk met the dark soil. The most important part is down there. The roots. If the roots are strong, the vine can survive almost anything. He looked at me, his eyes serious. Like Grandpa Henderson's roots? I smiled, my throat tight. Exactly like that. These vines, they're his stories. And it's our job to take care of them so we can keep telling them. He nodded, and then with the boundless energy of a boy, he was off again, chasing a butterfly down the row. I stood and watched him go, a small figure against the vast green tapestry of the vineyard. My vineyard. In the years since I had taken over, I had not spoken to my parents. They never came to the property. My father, facing a fraud investigation from the insurance company, had sold their house and they'd moved to a condo in a suburb of Seattle, far from the valley and the whispers. Nathan had disappeared from the wine world completely. Last I heard, he was selling luxury cars. I supposed it was a good fit. There's a painful truth society doesn't like to talk about. We're told that family is everything, that blood is the one bond that can never be broken. But that's a lie. Sometimes the most necessary act of love is not to hold on, but to let go, to amputate a limb that has turned gangrenous to save the rest of the body. My decision to cut my parents out of my life wasn't an act of hate, it was an act of preservation. They were a blight, not on the vines, but on the very idea of legacy itself. They saw history as a burden, integrity as a cost. To protect what my grandfather had built, I had to sever my connection to the people who were actively trying to poison its roots. Blood makes you related, but it doesn't make you family. Loyalty, respect, a shared understanding of what is sacred, that's what builds a family. My family now was Maria, who was thankfully in remission, her quiet strength a constant anchor. It was Luke, with his grandfather's eyes, and his uncomplicated love. It was Sal and his crew, who treated these vines with the reverence of monks. It was even Arthur Abernathy, who called every few months to ask about the Eleanor's progress. I hadn't just saved a vineyard. I had built a new family, one bound, not by genetics, but by a shared belief in the importance of the roots. Luke came running back, his hands cupped. "Look, Mom." He opened his fingers to reveal a perfectly ripe Eleanor grape skin, the color of a deep twilight. "Can I try one?" "Of course," I said. He popped it into his mouth, and his eyes went wide. "It tastes like cam, like stories," he said, echoing my own words. I pulled him into a hug, breathing in the scent of his sun-warmed hair. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the valley and painting the rows of vines in shades of gold and purple. The harvest was coming soon. It was going to be a good one, a very good one.